Welcome back to the Sherry Sylvester Show. The vibe is still electric here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation as we continue to celebrate the great victory of last week, the passage of the education savings accounts in both the Texas House and the Texas Senate, a goal we have been working towards for 32 years. Which naturally made me think about my guest today, Lee Parsley, the President and General Counsel of Texans for Lawsuit Reform. I worked with Lee at TLR, which has been working for over 3 decades, toward long-term goals that sometimes take more than 1 or 2 sessions to be realized. When TLR was formed back in 1994, Texas was known as the Wild West of litigation. The state was losing jobs and doctors, and the economy was in the tank. 30 years later, Texas is the 8th largest economy in the world and the job creator for the nation. Achievements that can be traced directly to the diligence of Texans for Lawsuit Reform. A few years ago, Texas Monthly said, in the history of Texas, there's never been anything like Texans for Lawsuit Reform. I'm not sure they meant that as a compliment, but I think it's true. Lee has been around for almost all those battles, and I'm not just speaking metaphorically. When you battle with personal injury trial lawyers, you are truly in a war. Lee's worked with TLR since 2002 and now serves as President and General Counsel, leading a team of attorneys who help identify and research solutions to the challenges facing Texas's legal system, making sure that the Texas miracle built on job-creating businesses can continue to thrive. Lee, welcome to the Sherry Sylvester Show.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm glad to be here.
What did I get wrong? What did I leave out in that introduction in terms of the 30 years?
Well, it was beautiful, your introduction, but you're right. Texans for Lawsuit Reform, founded in 1994, started working in 1995 at the Texas Capitol. That was our first session. We came into politics at the same time George Bush was running for governor. Mm-hmm. And he was running on a tort reform platform that happened to be one that we had developed, the TLR agenda, and that in education and maybe a thing or two else. And he got elected. We went to the Capitol that session with some new state senators that we'd helped elect, some good conservatives. And at the time, the governor, of course, was a newly elected Republican. The legislature was operated really by Democrats still in 1994 in Texas, a Democrat lieutenant governor, a Democrat speaker of the House, and yet we got tort reform done in 1995. And we've still been working at it because it needs work. It is a constant challenge to maintain a civil justice system that's fair, balanced, that's as efficient as we can make it, and we work on those things every day and have for now 32 years.
Well, what did you stop when you say you reformed the civil justice system? What exactly is tort reform for the regular person that just sits in front of their TV and hears 4, 4, 4, 4?
Well, that is a great question, Sherry. First, let's just start with the idea of a tort,
okay,
which has nothing to do with the pastry, right? a tort is a wrong done by one person to another person or their property, an injury caused to another person or their property. And tort law is the law that allows a person who is injured to recover damages. That's tort law, and you distinguish it from, for example, contract law, where 2 people are in a contract and one breaches the contract and there's a lawsuit about that, or family law, where people are getting divorced, or criminal law, which is a whole different section. Tort law is just an area to its own in the law and really focuses on injury and death litigation. So people who have been injured or their loved one has been killed, they have a cause of action oftentimes, and they go to courts to get compensation for that injury. And so that's tort law.
That seems like that's important.
Sure.
If someone hurts you or damages your property.
Absolutely. We at TLR every day are cognizant of the fact that any of us could be on the interstate and hit by a truck. You, I, or anybody else. And we all need access to the civil justice system. And we need a fair system, and we need one that operates pretty efficiently and gets us a good answer to our problem, which is that we've been injured or our loved one has been injured. So our job at TLR is not to end those kind of lawsuits, and never has been. Our job at TLR is to make sure the system is operating in a fair manner for both the plaintiff and the defendant in that system. That's what tort reform is about, is that in the 1980s, Texas had become just a bastion of really plaintiff lawyers and fairly liberal judges in many places. And we were seeing verdicts and judgments that were just enormous, and they were discouraging business development in Texas. Businesses who were thinking about capital investment were investing at places other than Texas because our tort environment was so imbalanced. And so our job at TLR...
So they knew they'd get sued, the likelihood of being sued was
they knew
small.
they'd get sued, and they might suffer an enormous verdict that just shut down the company. And sometimes an enormous verdict is what's deserved. But many times, the enormous verdicts are the result of some manipulation of the system or some unfairness or imbalance in how we've set up the system that really needs to be addressed so that we get things back in the proper balance, where people who are injured have a chance to go to court and get a fair compensation, and those who didn't cause the injury have a chance to get out of the lawsuit at no cost. That's really the bottom line, is you're trying to balance two different parties' rights in a way that makes sense to the general public and to the legal system.
Talk about some of how did Texas get so out of whack? I know that there was a 60-minute expose and checks were being handed out on the legislative floor. How did it get so out of balance?
Well, it took a little time. The lawyers who do plaintiff cases, injury and death cases, do it on a contingent fee. That is, they win if you win, and they get nothing if you lose. And so they've got an economic motivation, just like a realtor who's selling your house has an economic motivation to maximize the value of your house. The plaintiff lawyers have an economic motivation to maximize the value of litigation because they're getting paid on a percentage basis. And they had managed to convince the legislature in a number of instances to sort of create new ways to maximize their income. And frankly, the Texas Supreme Court had become very plaintiff lawyer friendly. And 60 Minutes, their expose in the 1980s is justice for sale in Texas, because plaintiff lawyers were flying members of the Texas Supreme Court staff, for example, to Las Vegas for weekends. So it doesn't take long for anyone to realize that's not a system that we should have. You should not have lawyers who are representing clients in front of the Texas Supreme Court paying to take the Supreme Court staff to Las Vegas for weekends.
Yeah, seems questionable.
Seems questionable, right? So even 60 Minutes, who is, they're not always on our side. Even 60 Minutes thought that was pretty questionable conduct. And so it had gotten out of balance. The judgments and verdicts were quite large, and Lloyd's of London, for example, was beginning to charge a surcharge to businesses who were operating in Texas. So their insurance premiums were going up because Lloyd's of London thought Texas was such a risky environment in which to be sued.
Wow.
That they were charging a surcharge. Doctors were fleeing the state because their medical liability insurance, they have to have insurance to operate, not literally operate, but to be in business.
Sure.
Like all of us, everybody needs insurance to secure against risk. And the malpractice premiums for doctors were so high that we've got great medical schools. They graduate from medical school and run to some other state to practice medicine. And it's not only not good for the doctors, it's not good for me and you. We all need access to health care. And access to health care is a direct function of how many professionals you have here practicing medicine. And so as we were driving them out of the state with a tort environment that wasn't working for Texans, we were limiting access to health care. We were making it harder to get good jobs because corporations were not coming here to expand, and were not making their capital investments in Texas. And it all really just had to change. And that's why TLR came on the scene in 1994, because it was just so imbalanced. Mm-hmm. And here we are.
And then they just walked away, right?
Well, the founders of TLR would tell you that they thought that they would, essentially they did. They thought they would come to Austin, they would fix the system, and they would go home. And it just doesn't work that way. It takes, like everything in life pretty much, it requires diligence. Consistency.
It's sometimes you just have got to go, this is a great country. I mean, the trial lawyers have just been ingenious in the things that they have done. Chasing hurricanes, looking at how they could maximize profits out of that particular tragedy in people's lives.
Right. Hurricane litigation became so such a big thing for a faction of the plaintiffs' bar, and they were doing so well at it that they were about to bankrupt the insurer of last resort down on the coast called the Texas Windstorm Insurance Association. And that all of us fund that TWIA. We all, through one mechanism or another, we end up putting money into TWIA so that people can have houses and businesses along the coast. And they just about bankrupt TWIA when 2 hurricanes came through in around 2007 or 8, I believe. Mm-hmm. And because TWIA would get overwhelmed with lawsuits all at the same time, because a hurricane is an event that happens. It damages thousands potentially of pieces of property. And they had obligations under Texas law to promptly deal with their insureds to pay their claims. Nothing wrong with that. You want your insurance company to pay claims promptly and fully. We all do. But TWIA just could not handle the surge because they, day in and day out, they didn't have much to do. And then a hurricane would blow in and they would have too much to do. And so they fell behind on resolving claims. And that created an opening for the plaintiff lawyers to sue them for the late payment of claims. And it just almost bankrupt TWIA. So that was one element of what the plaintiff lawyers did for a period of time. Mold litigation. You remember mold litigation?
No, I'd forgotten about mold, yeah.
Right. Toxic mold. You just heard about it all the time, toxic mold. Well, there are people who are allergic to mold. Mm-hmm. It's very seldom actually toxic if it's in the walls of your house. And the plaintiff lawyers had just made an entire industry out of suing home builders and insurance companies over toxic mold is what they called it. Well, the science never really supported it very much. Most of us sneeze a little from mold, but it's not terribly harmful to us, and there's mold in the air all the time. And so that was a thing for a while. And so they jumped from one thing to another. Dredging. Whoever thought? Do you remember the dredging industry?
Oh, right, yeah.
Texas has no natural deep water ports. So if you're going to be...
But lots of ports, 100 ports.
Yeah, tons of ports. None of them are naturally deep. There are deep water ports in Europe, but not in Texas. Our ports all are pretty shallow, and they fill up with sand. So the dredging industry digs out the sand so that you can bring the big ships in. And it is critical to our economy that big ships come and go from our ports. We have some of the busiest ports in the world. The Port of Houston is one of the busiest ports in the world. And it's exporting a lot of products from Texas and bringing a lot of things in, and it's a huge economic driver. Well, the plaintiffs' attorneys at some point started recruiting clients, people who had worked on dredging ships, and suddenly a year later they would have a back injury. They would hire a particular plaintiff lawyer in Houston, and his doctors would diagnose a back injury, and they would sue the dredging company, and they would sue the dredging company in one of 4 counties in South Texas, no matter where the injury allegedly happened. And their lawyer was dumb enough, back to Las Vegas, to go to Las Vegas and tell a group of defense lawyers, and they taped him, that I have the judges in my pocket in South Texas, and the juries will give me anything I want. And so if I sue you in a dredging case, you just need to settle with me, and you need to pay me what I want. And he was on tape. And strangely, we got the tape, and we used it in the legislative process to say, this is not how the system is supposed to work. And so the fix for that, of all the things, was just to say you have to file your dredging lawsuit for an injury in the county related to where the injury happened. You just couldn't file it in you just couldn't pick a South Texas county. You had to go to Harris County or Galveston County or Jefferson County, whatever county was next to where the injury happened. And it completely changed the environment of dredging litigation in the sense that we went from several hundred a year, which were about to shut down the dredging industry. I didn't say that a minute ago. Here's the thing with dredging. The companies that dredge our ports can just as easily go dredge ports in Louisiana and New York. Mm-hmm. Their dredging boats dredge everywhere. They don't have to work in Texas. And they were saying our insurance premiums are so nuts in this state that we're just going to go dredge in Louisiana. And anytime somebody chooses to go do business in Louisiana rather than Texas, it's probably a bad sign. The only worse sign than that is if they're going to New York, right? I mean, if they are choosing states other than ours because of our litigation environment, it's time for a change. So we changed the venue rule. The number of dredging lawsuits miraculously fell back down to its historically low standard measure because the lawsuits were kind of made up.
So it's kind of like whack-a-mole because this is America. These are ingenious entrepreneurs looking at ways to make money. I wanted to ask you, in terms of telling this story and the politics of it, the liberal and the conservative, Democrat, Republican politics of it, I remember Joe Biden said, and I wrote this down because I think about these things. He said, "I am the best friend trial lawyers ever had." So that was supporting this trial lawyer agenda was kind of bedrock in the Democrat Party. I'm not sure it is anymore. And opposing it was bedrock in our party. We understood that the Texas Miracle is built on, low taxes, reasonable regulation, and fair and honest courts.
Right.
So has there been a shift? I want to talk about the legislation you're working on now, but has there been a shift in the political view of the world, or is it just people aging out? We're not getting any younger, and all these other people can vote. And I mean, what's happened?
I think there are two shifts. One on both sides, things have shifted a little. My perception is on the plaintiff side, and the plaintiff lawyers, as you noted, were fairly substantial contributors to Democrat candidates up and down the ballot.
Like almost the total contributions. I think I wrote a couple of times that the total contributions to the Democrat Party would be 80% trial lawyers. We're talking millions here, and maybe 20% people of Texas.
Right. And so that has shifted. That it is not so much funded in Democrat politics by the trial lawyers anymore. And they certainly are not funding the group called the Texas Trial Lawyers Association's PAC like they used to. So that is partly aging out, like you say. The old school trial lawyers that were so successful in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are just not as active anymore. And they're not funding the PAC, and they're not putting as much money into politics. And the new crop of successful plaintiff lawyers just don't seem to be as interested in politics as far as we can tell. And some of them, in fact, contribute to Republican politics. That's a wave that you see, is that they are beginning to try to go elect Republicans in Republican primaries using money that used to go into Democratic politics. On the Republican side, it was that tort reform was on everybody's mind. Republican candidates across the state for a number of years ran on a tort reform agenda as part of what they talked about. They talked about it every day, and that was part of what they said they were coming to Austin to accomplish. That we see a lot less of that today. Again, it's generational, because I think many of the new state senators and state representatives are just younger, and they weren't around in the bad old days when Texas was run by the trial lawyers, and they just don't have as much appreciation for what it looks like when you get a civil justice system that doesn't function correctly anymore.
It's interesting. I have this conversation. I'm at TPPF, and there's a lot of us. We have about 100 people on the staff at TPPF, and a lot of my younger colleagues somehow think that it's just inherent in Texas makeup that we're a rich state.
Right.
And there'll always be a budget surplus, because there always is. And population will always increase, and businesses will always come here. And I feel like Yoda when I say, "Oh no, it could be bad." And I think it probably falls on those kind of ears. What's with this crazy old person?
Yeah, you have to say, "Oh, bad it would be." you have to flip that around if you're going to be Yoda in there.
Yes, Sherry. Bad it would be, absolutely.
Right. Well, we have the same sense at TLR. Times change, but we were not always the largest economy in the world. We were not always as successful. We are here through conservative efforts over decades at this point to make change, and to make change that makes sense for citizens and makes sense for our economy. And it's worked, but it's not by accident.
No.
And it can go away if you don't tend to it.
We're fortunate. I mean, we've got pretty much boomer leadership, and so our leaders understand that. Certainly, Abbott does.
Yeah.
And Lieutenant Governor Patrick Burrows is a little younger, but I think he probably understands that too.
Now, I think our leadership understands it. I think they understand what makes Texas successful, and they want to continue to do what it is that has brought us to this point. My sense is that the legislature and the speaker in particular, I think, are very business interested. I heard the speaker yesterday said the business of Texas is business. And I think that's an operating theory on the House side this year, and that's a good one for all of us.
Is there something culturally, I hadn't thought of this before, but with the big trial lawyers, and I wanted to ask you how, if any, people who don't know the names of the old trial lawyers should just look at the law schools around the state, because they built all the law schools.
I've got a story about that too.
Well, let's hear it.
Well, there was one particular plaintiff lawyer who wanted to have the Texas Tech Law School renamed for him. Mm-hmm. And I was one of those people who said, well, maybe we can put his name on the library. Maybe we can, but I don't think we ought to rename something that the citizens of Texas taxpayers have paid for a very long time, because I went to Tech Law School and he was a Tech Law grad as well.
Yeah, I knew we'd get the Red Raider.
Eventually I'd get to that. So I and others complained about this renaming of the law school, and he said, well, if I can't rename the law school, I'm not giving you the amount of money. I'm not giving you any money. And he pulled his plan to give multiple millions of dollars to the Texas Tech Law School, and it's still named the Texas Tech Law School, by the way. But that got me a spot on the foundation board where you were expected to give money every year. Me and several others who
had to make it up.
I couldn't even come close to that, but at least I could do my little part. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I think about, I live in San Antonio, but I think it's all over, is the really successful trial lawyers often do ads of themselves coming off their own private jets. Right. And I'm wondering, there's a particularly around younger people, they like rich people.
Right. It's appealing.
And where I would look at that person in our day and we would think, well, that's an ambulance chaser.
Right.
That's a guy that victimizes people who have been damaged. I think now they look at it and go,
that's a successful person, and so I want to do business with that person.
Right, yeah. There were some stats on your website I wanted to ask you about. It was that 71% of people, of respondents that were surveyed in this LexisNexis survey, reported their attorneys encouraged them to seek additional medical treatment.
Yes.
What's that about?
Well, that feeds into a bigger topic, which is these lawyers, if you watch their advertisements, they say, call us first. Call us now. Open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Call us now. Why do they want you to do that? Because if you've actually been injured, or you think you might have been injured, or you've been in an accident and you just want to consult with a lawyer, they want to get to you fast, like any good salesperson. Mm-hmm. And they want to sign you up, and they want to sign you up for a contingent fee contract, which right now, historically, when I was a young lawyer, the contingent fee contracts were a third. The lawyer got a third. The client got the other 2/3. Today, the contingent fees are at least 40%, maybe 44 or 45%, and in the worst cases, 50% of the person's take in a lawsuit. Then what they want to do is they want to put you into their system of doctors and chiropractors. They don't want you to go to a legitimate doctor or chiropractor. And this is not all lawyers or not all the doctors and chiropractors, but it's just a specialty area for them. And they want you to go to their folks who will run up the medical bill for the purpose of running up the damages in a lawsuit. It is a system that I think, frankly, is fraud. It's fraud on the court system, but it is what they do today to make these lawsuits worthwhile. And so the reason they're worth 40 or 45 or 50% is because they have this system in place. And if you'll call them first and you'll be put into their system, they can just almost guarantee you're going to be better than the honest personal injury lawyer down the street. Yeah. Because the honest person's not going to do that. The honest person's not going to just go run up the medical bills for the purpose of maximizing a lawsuit. Yeah. But yes, we hear stories, which really is disappointing, that the medical providers who are in this process will literally be in contact with the plaintiff lawyer office to find out whether to continue to treat the patient. Now, medical treatments should not be dependent on your lawsuit. Whether the insurance company's got more money in its pocket to pay for more medical treatments is not actually a criteria for making you well.
Right. It's criminal.
It's a fraud on the system. And then they'll present these medical bills to juries as if they're legitimate, and jurors, have a hard time sorting out the good from the bad sometimes on this, because they don't know about the relationship between the doctor and the lawyer. They don't know that these people do this day in and day out and day in and day out for years at a time. They they tend to believe the doctor who's on the stand saying, "Oh yes, this person has a tragic injury from a fender bender," and they just really have a difficult time sorting out the truth of that. And that's where we are today. That's how this current personal injury practice is built, is to inflate medical damages dramatically. And when I say inflate them, seriously, you will see medical bills where, for example, the Medicare might pay $1,250 for a service, and the doctor in litigation will bill $25,000 for it.
Wow.
And sit down and tell a jury that's a legitimate medical bill.
Well, one of the things culturally, too, that has changed, particularly on the conservative side, is that there's a lot of outrage. We see a lot of government waste. We see, all over, we see a lot of waste in business. And it seems like I'm seeing more and more legislation at the Capitol that includes a cause of action, so that the legislation will say, well, let's sue them. Let's give them the right to sue. Are you seeing that too, and why do you think that is?
We are seeing it. More and more bills have a cause of action in them. Many of them, in fact, will go back to our 1995 agenda when George Bush was first elected. And at that time, we made some changes that included putting some sort of rules of the road in about punitive damages, the damages that are used to punish someone, a defendant who has acted particularly badly. You can punish them through the civil justice system. You can get an award of money that they have to pay as punishment. And we put rules of the road in for that. And for example, you've got to prove them by clear and convincing evidence, which is a higher standard, which no one really understands, but it works. There has to be a unanimous jury verdict. There are some caps on punitive damages. And you will see bills today that say all of those things that we shed blood over in 1995 and again in 2003 just don't apply to the bill I've just filed. So they will actually not only create a cause of action, but they'll go back in time and exempt their cause of action from things that we really worked hard to get into place in 2 and 3 decades ago. And we see it more and more and more. And it is a cultural change, and it is partly because I think our folks these days don't understand the pernicious effect of creating an environment where everybody thinks that every problem is solved by a lawsuit. And that's what we've tried to talk about for a very long time, is that a lawsuit is not often the best answer to your problem. It sometimes is the answer, but often it is not the best answer. And in building it into statutes over and over and over again is going to begin to eat at us. It's going to begin to cause us problems economically, we're afraid.
Yeah.
The other thing I'm seeing at the Capitol is the flip side of that. I go to the House Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee almost every week and sit through their hearings and often testify.
You've got to get a life, Lee.
I do, Sherry, I do. But you will hear.
Yeah, there's some committee hearings that are much more interesting than that.
Yeah, and so I've heard over and over this session, every committee hearing, there will be 1 or 2 bills where some industry is in the JCJ committee saying, please give us relief from the lawsuit environment. Wow. The funeral industry has a bill in the Capitol saying, man, our insurance rates are so high that we cannot afford to be in the funeral business anymore, and it's driving out mom and pop funeral home operators all over the state, and they're saying, give us relief. The water park industry has been in the Capitol saying, man, our litigation environment is so bad, our liability environment is so bad, we, the water park industry, need relief. And I could go on and on. I've probably seen 10 different industries come in and say, give us help specific to us. Don't worry about anybody else. Just help us, because we are in a terrible spot right now in our litigation environment. And the legislature is listening to that. So at the same time the legislature is listening to people come in and say, lawsuits are killing us, then there are tons of bills filed to create new ways for people to sue, new lawsuits. And those two things don't seem compatible to me.
Right.
So we've got work to do, I think, with our legislature and with our society more broadly. It's cultural. To say this really isn't the answer most of the times. The lawsuits is really your last resort, not your first resort. Call me first, like they're advertising on TV, really should not be a message that our citizens take in and think is appropriate. They should say to that, let me think about it. Let me see if there's other ways to resolve my problem before I call this lawyer and hire them.
Right.
Yeah.
And all of those businesses, of course, make up the Texas Miracle. That's where the jobs are. That's where everything.
Absolutely, and some of them are absolutely critical to us. I mean, you can't put all your funeral homes out of business.
No.
You can't put the funeral home out of business in Alpine, because then Marfa probably doesn't have one, and the next thing you know, you've got to go to Midland for a funeral service. Right?
Exactly.
That's the consequence, and often the consequence is most deeply felt in the rural areas. Back to tort reform, where we started, or the early days, and medical liability reform. The places it was hurting the most were the rural areas. Rural Texans were losing their doctors. You could not have an OBGYN doctor in many rural areas of Texas before 2003.
Or an orthopedist.
Yeah. The malpractice rates were so high, and it was they just could not afford to go practice in the rural areas. And so the first people to be hurt by the litigation environment really is rural Texas.
Well, before we go, I want to make sure you get to talk about Senate Bill 30, the priority bill for you, priority bill for the Lieutenant Governor, and how, after all this work which you've described, do we have legislation about nuclear verdicts?
Well, that is another good question. Let me give your listeners a couple of facts fairly quickly. We, TLR, sat down and did our best to identify. There's no reporting service that you can just go to and print these out. So we had to dig through a lot of files to identify what we call nuclear verdicts. We didn't give it that name, someone else did. But we're talking about verdicts of over $10 million in cases involving a person or two as a plaintiff. So not big class actions, not big mass actions, not giant corporation versus corporation fights. But these are just one or two persons in a family suing over an injury or death case. We found 104 of those $10 million verdicts in Texas since January 1st of 2016 through about the 1st of this year. The largest of those verdicts, a single death case, and any death is tragic. Don't get me wrong about that. But it was $7.375 billion. That's the largest of the single-person injury death cases in Texas verdicts. That's big. 12 verdicts are over $200 million. 20 verdicts over $100 million. To make the top 25 list in Texas, you've got to break the $72 million mark to get in the top 25. So those are astoundingly large numbers. It is, again, a little bit cultural, just like you and I have been talking about. Our citizens, I think part of it is that they see my Red Raider Patrick Mahomes get a $500 million contract. They all these big money figures they hear about. Our jurors tend to be, and our younger generation tends to be, more persuaded, and they have less sense about the value of the dollar, I think. And that's part of what drives this. And then part of what's driving it is, as I described, this inflation of medical damages. And the way that helps drive this is, if you've been in a fender bender and you have a sore back and the local hospital told you to take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning, you're probably not going to get very much in pain and suffering in a lawsuit. But if you go to the plaintiff lawyer pretty quickly and you get into his system and you run up $350,000 worth of unpaid medical bills, and this is what happens. And then your lawyer tells the jury, with the help of the medical doctor, that you are so badly injured that you need a lifetime of care and that you'll never live without pain and you'll never pick up your grandchild again. That's how you get a nuclear verdict. Mm-hmm. So it does start with this fraud at medical damages in many cases. That's the building block on which we end up with some big numbers. And I'll tell you one specific case to demonstrate this. It was out of East Texas, so not one of the big cities. Mm-hmm. Fender bender, both parties, the truck driver and the guy in the pickup, get out of their vehicles and they both say, not hurt. They tell the local police officer. The fellow goes on to his church social, but his dad suggests he go see a plaintiff lawyer, which he does on Monday morning after the accident on Saturday. And the plaintiff lawyer puts him into his medical system, and they run up, I think the jury ultimately awarded something like $160,000 of medical bills from a fender bender where he said he wasn't hurt. And then it awarded him $101 million in damages in that case. Wow. $101 million from a fender bender. That's the kind of nuclear verdict we're concerned about. If you're legitimately injured in a case, Senate Bill 30 won't change your ability to go get a fair compensation in the Texas court system. But I do think Senate Bill 30 is going to make it harder to run up the medical bills, and it's going to make it harder to get $100 million in a fender bender. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're trying to do. We're being very cautious and strategic, like we always have been, about trying to draw the line between people who are legitimately injured and deserve their day in court and deserve fair compensation, and those who've been recruited by lawyers largely for the lawyers to maximize their own take and to have a bigger airplane and a nicer car and that they can advertise. And so that's where we're trying to draw the line with Senate Bill 30, and I think it does a good job of that. And we're not closed, and I know the Lieutenant Governor isn't either. This has been a priority bill for him. We're not closed-minded about legitimate criticisms, and we've taken changes to the bill as it went through the Senate. There may be a few more changes in the bill as it goes through the House because we want to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. We're dedicated to that, and I think at the end of the day, when Senate Bill 30 becomes the law, it will continue to make Texas a good place to live and work. You'll have the right to go to trial and get a fair verdict when you need it. But I hope we cut down a little bit on the advertising TV lawyers' ability to succeed in this state, because some of what they're doing is not right.
In the last minute that we have, what else are you working on that is critical, you think? Well, everything you're working on is critical.
Yeah, that's critical. And then we're trying to work with members of the legislature about their bills that have causes of action in them. We try not to be reflexively against those as well, but we sit down with them and say, is there a better way? Is there a better enforcement mechanism? We do a fair amount of that with the members of the legislature. And then we support oftentimes those industries that need the help, like the funeral home industry when they've got specific problems. So we've got a lot of work. We're busy. We've got about 5 or 6 weeks left in the session. I've quit counting.
Oh, my gosh.
But it's almost over.
Well, Lee, thanks so much for coming in. Lee does, and his colleagues at TLR do a podcast every Tuesday. Tuesdays at TLR. Is that the copy?
TLR Tuesdays.
TLR
Yep.
Tuesdays, tortreform.com. You can find information there. Right. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you all for joining us on the Sherry Sylvester Show. You can subscribe to the Sherry Sylvester Show at Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Sylvester1630. And if you'd like to receive my 9th in Congress newsletter, including my weekly winners and losers list, you can sign up at the TPPF website, www.texaspolicy.com/9th in Congress. See you next time.